Okay, welcome everybody for this week's Bradford talk. Our speaker today is Lindsey Guinther, and she's traveled from Colorado to be with us today. Lindsey's a geographer like me, and with bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Colorado and the University of South Carolina. Following her master's degree work, she's went on to work for 11 years as an analyst and manager working in wind energy at EDF Renewables. Lindsey's currently the Director of Environmental Affairs at Lightsource BP, a global firm focused on onshore renewable energy. In her work, she conducts spatial analysis to inform investments decisions of her company on site suitability and disaster risk. Today, she'll be sharing her perspectives on the topic of renewable resilience, solar energy as a climate solution. Please join me in welcoming Lindsey to SPIA.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Eric. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And just making sure the folks in the back, can you hear me okay? Okay, great. All right, so I always like to give folks a little bit of a roadmap of where I'll be going in my talk today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and why I view the world through the lenses that I do. Next, I'll give you an overview of Lightsource BP, the company I work for, talk about our sustainability framework, and then do a deeper dive into our environmental stewardship portion of our sustainability framework. I also briefly touch upon our social responsibility pillar of our sustainability framework, and then I'll switch gears and talk with you about some challenges that we've seen to solar deployment and how the industry, as well as Lightsource BP, has responded to those challenges. And then finally, I want to leave you with some parting thoughts and next steps, because we've made a lot of progress in the time that I've been in the industry, but we still have a lot of work to do. Okay, so my background is as a hazards geographer, and I was really fortunate to be able to work with Eve Grunfest in my undergraduate and work on research projects funded by the National Center for Atmospheric Research and National Science Foundation. Her dedication to applied hazards geography really encouraged me and inspired me to go on and get my master's degree, where I had the pleasure of working with yet another distinguished hazards researcher, Susan Cutter, but also with a really, really fabulous cohort of individuals. So as you all sit here, students in the room, take advantage of that. Lean into your cohort. It is an amazing resource that will serve you throughout your life. So after that, I went back to Colorado. It's really where my family is, and I did a short stint in emergency management, but after that, I found myself in renewable energy, and I've been there ever since, about 17 years. So the first 11, 12 years were within wind, and then more recently, the last 5 here are solar and battery energy storage. I got my start in the industry because of my GIS skills. I helped bring projects from inception through development, construction, and operations. And I did this for over 600 megawatts of now operating wind sites. I then switched roles within my organization to focus on siting. And I used multi-criteria site suitability spatial modeling to site more than 2 gigawatts of wind projects. Of that, more than 1 gigawatt is in operations today. And now I focus at Lightsource BP on siting, multi-use solar, risk mitigation, and resilience. And so you will see these themes kind of come through in my talk. And I want to share this with you because it really is foundational to the way that I approach my work. I approach it through a data-driven science foundation, but in a very applied and pragmatic setting to deploy renewable energy resources across the United States. Okay, so just a little bit about Lightsource BP, the company that I work for. We are a global company operating in 20 different regions, but you can see from our US track record that the US is a very important part of our global strategy. And just as on a personal note, when I started in the company, I was employee 50. We almost have 300 people in the US now, and we had less than 100 megawatts of operating, developed assets. Now we have over 4 gigawatts. So it's really been amazing to be part of this journey and helping Lightsource BP grow and really become from a startup to a big player in the industry, especially here in the US. And as I mentioned, we are a global company where we really focus on having local impact. So this is just to illustrate and show you where across the world we are working from a global perspective. All right, so now our sustainability framework. This is really our commitment to energy, environment, and people, and it guides all that we do. So energy is the first pillar, and I think this is pretty self-explanatory because that's what we do. We deliver affordable, reliable, renewable energy projects to decarbonize the world's energy landscape. But these other pillars are also very important to us. Environmental stewardship. We work to enhance ecosystems and biodiversity, taking science-based action and improving circularity. And then in regards to social responsibility, this is all about our people, partners, and communities. And because of the lens that I view the world through because of my academic background, for me, social responsibility also means designing and operating climate-resilient projects for increased reliability. So now I'm going to focus on our environmental stewardship portion. And so first of all, it's important to illustrate that we bring benefits beyond just the renewable energy itself from an environmental perspective. We promote circularity and recycling. We have committed to recycling all of our end-of-life panels, working exclusively with vetted facilities by the Solar Energy Industry Association. We also support pollinators and create habitat and biodiversity on our sites through our site-specific land management programs, as well as our seeding plants. We integrate agriculture in many of our US sites, mostly through sheep grazing and beekeeping. We improve soil health. We allow the soil to rest for decades at these sites, and it's also protected from urban sprawl. And then finally, improved water quality. We improve water quality at our sites largely through our pre-seeding and revegetation approaches, but there's actually been quite a bit of research done recently in this realm as well, and I have a couple links here that I can share afterwards as well. So really, we approach a solar project as a multi-use solar farm, right? Co-locating habitat conservation, research, and agrivoltaics, we layer on these additional benefits onto the land and under the solar panels. And I want to just focus on the agricultural component. So agrivoltaics comes from the root words agriculture and photovoltaics, and we are a leader in this space, and it's something we're really proud of and a big part of our ethos. So for this year, we will have 23 sites across the United States with co-located farm activities. This means we'll have 3 gigawatts of projects with solar grazing and over 20,000 sheep doing this really important job for us. We also purchase 1,000 pounds of solar honey every year, but our beekeepers actually make a lot more that they can then sell into the open market, further supplementing their income. Okay, so I talked about agrivoltaics and how we're a leader in this space, but I think it's also important to just take a step back and talk about what is agrivoltaics from a definition perspective, because there's not necessarily one agreed upon definition. Kind of depends upon the place in the world that you live, the shoes that you stand in. So this is the definition according to the shoes that I stand in. It needs to be a co-location of ground-mounted photovoltaics with one or more of the following agricultural activities. So grazing agrivoltaics, we have an example on the bottom of the slide here at Colorado. This is our Bighorn site in Colorado. We also have AV habitat systems. Sometimes these are called ecovoltaics. And this is PV with habitat restoration. Sometimes this includes beekeeping, sometimes it does not. The picture in the middle here, this is our site in Indiana, where we do have both pollinator habitat and apiary happening. But there has been research done out of the University of Illinois' PHASE project that has looked at the benefits of habitat enhancements at solar projects around habitat for pollinators, and that is having a positive impact on the crop yields in the neighboring areas. So providing this important habitat helps provide these resources for pollinators to really be able to have healthy ecosystems and support the crop production within the region. And then the last type of agrivoltaics is crop agrivoltaics. And this picture is an example of one of our UK sites where we're doing haying. And we do have one site in the US where we're doing this, and it's a really great story. The sheep grazer lives right next to our solar project, and he is an Amish gentleman. So he opens up the gate and lets his sheep into the array to do the grazing, and the area outside of the array, he is doing this haying by horse and buggy. So it's really a beautiful story of kind of new world and old world meet and are harmoniously working together. All right, now I'm going to dive into social responsibility, but I'm just going to touch this one very lightly, just to make sure that I have time to make sure we can get into questions and answers too. So we are committed to bringing value to local communities. This is not only through our renewable energy infrastructure itself, but it's also through jobs. We offer many jobs largely through construction and into operations that local individuals can fill. Tax revenue is another benefit that comes to local communities, and much of this tax revenue we've seen go directly to benefiting public schools. Our landowners continue to own the land that we deploy our renewable energy projects on, but we lease that land from them. So we provide a steady revenue for farmers and ranchers who may have other more variable income streams if 1 year is particularly difficult due to drought conditions, for instance. We also do a lot of partnerships to bring value to local communities. So this picture is from our Colorado site where we partnered with an organization called Grid Alternatives, where they trained individuals in the community that were underemployed or unemployed on how to install solar, and then we hired them to build our solar site. So not only did we give them a training and an immediate job, but we gave them a skill set that they can continue to do throughout their lives. We did a similar partnership in Texas with veterans. And then finally, educational opportunities. Solar sites are great places to bring busfuls of children or community members or our legislative people in a district to really see what a solar project looks like and be able to separate that out from misinformation and see the benefits that it brings environmentally but also to the community. All right, so now I'm going to switch gears and I want to focus more on this area. Challenges to solar deployment. We absolutely need to deploy solar at scale to meet our energy goals, but we do face a lot of challenges. So first off, I want to address a misconception that solar doesn't have to comply with state and federal laws. Absolutely not true. Just like any other form of energy, just like any other form of development, we have to comply with all state and federal laws. Plus, solar development requires hundreds of site suitability and engineering considerations and many times studies. So this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, but it should help give you an idea about some of the challenges and some of the considerations that we have to weigh when siting a site and when designing it. And I think there's an important thing here about balance too, that many times we have to balance how we approach things. So the map in the center is from First Street. It's their modeled fire risk, and this is now available on Zillow, so anybody can go and look at this model. And you can see it varies across the United States. Now, while we implement biodiversity initiatives and biodiversity uplift at all of our sites, what that looks like may vary. And we may also need to balance how we implement biodiversity initiatives with things like how we mitigate for fire risk. Another consideration here is that in my time in the industry, I've looked at gigawatts of projects. And I've seen a lot of really great projects come to my desk where so many of these suitability and engineering considerations really line up to make an excellent project. But if there is not available transmission, so it's not just about proximity, but being able to actually have space on the line. Much of our transmission grid is already very constrained and doesn't have more room, so to say. And so developers spend years and millions of dollars to figure out how much space is there, and then how much do they have to pay to upgrade the system to be able to put that project into place. So I think this is just a very harsh reality of renewable energy across our landscape. It's very dependent upon the grid, and in many cases, transmission has been a deal breaker for a project. So it's about balance, but it's also about understanding how each of these considerations factor into making a successful project. All right, now I want to talk about just how much land we need for solar. So this is according to the Solar Future Study. This is a study that was completed by NREL. And the map on the left is a cartogram. And as a geographer, I love these kind of maps because it's such a fun way to look at, well, what does 0.5% of the land area of the United States look like? And what does that look like in contrast to our other land uses, right? And so from this view, it seems like this is actually a very small percentage of the United States that we need to deploy solar. However, there continues to be some challenges and conflicts around land use. The graphic on the bottom here, I want to focus on, it's from the same study, but it represents the information visually a little bit different. And at first glance, we could say, oh, well, there's plenty of room between contaminated land and disturbed areas that we could site all of our solar on. However, I talked about some of those challenges, particularly around transmission, but there's some other challenges I kind of want to dive into a little bit more here with you. And that's particularly around brownfield. So there's been some research done that has looked at the relative cost to building a solar site on a brownfield site versus a traditional PV greenfield site. And it comes at almost approximately 2 times the cost of a traditional site. So just from an economics perspective, it's challenging off the bat. Another challenge is that there's a strict liability regime of environmental law that disincentivizes renewable energy on brownfields. So unfortunately, even though the renewable energy developer had nothing to do with the contamination already in place, if we come in and move it around and exacerbate it, all of a sudden we become liable for that. And that, I mean, obviously it's just not logical, right? But that is the realm of reality that we are operating within. I talked about project financing. A project has to have project financing. Utility scale solar projects are very capital intensive, and some financing parties will just not provide financing for projects on brownfield lands without a meaningful comfort letter from the EPA. And unfortunately, the letters that we are getting now do not give financing parties the comfort that they need to reduce that uncertainty. So if you cannot obtain financing for a project does not happen. There are very few companies that have enough balance sheet to be able to move projects forward without financing. I talked a little bit about suitable land before in terms of transmission. But I want to call out this study that was done in Maryland and the methodology for their assessments on the side there. But they looked at EPA Repowering America sites. So these are sites that the EPA has said they're contaminated sites that we think is suitable for wind and solar. They did an analysis, and by going through this process of looking at slopes, existing structures, other infrastructure, the limited acreage of these sites themselves, it actually resulted in a 98% reduction of viable sites for Maryland within that data set. So I think this is an important study and scientific approach to looking at this that really highlights how limited these sites are for utility scale solar. Also related to EPA, to funding, is that there is EPA funding available for brownfield cleanup. However, it is not available to private developers, right? It's only available for like state agencies. So again, if this could become available, it could help offset those costs of building on brownfield sites. Another important consideration is in the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the tax adders that was included was energy communities. And the intention of this adder was to drive clean renewable energy into places that had been overburdened by either fossil fuel, coal, or other types of contamination. And brownfield was one of the 3 categories. However, how brownfield was defined in the Inflation Reduction Act is different than how it's defined in CERCLA, and it is more limiting. So unfortunately, sites like Superfund sites or sites contaminated by petroleum, which is a vast majority of sites in the US that could become viable for redevelopment, they are not eligible for this credit adder. So again, if they would have been, it could have really helped overcome those economics of needing to pay more to build in these areas. All right, so this last area in terms of the challenges, this really comes back to kind of my roots as a hazards geographer. And when I started in the industry 17 years ago, it was a very different landscape. It was a soft insurance market. We got really great terms in terms of all of our coverage, regardless of where the project was sited. But now, 17 years later, we've had a hardening in the insurance market across all sectors. And this is largely due to losses that the insurance sector has had to pay out from hurricanes and wildfires. But specific to solar, we have also seen more and more claims from hail impacting photovoltaic sites. And the map on the bottom here is from NOAA and sort of shows those concentric rings, areas of risk across the landscape. And you can see is a pretty vast area of our country that is exposed to risk from hail. And so this has also resulted in higher deductibles if there is a hail event, as well as sublimits. So really limiting how much insurers will actually pay forward when there is an event. Similarly with flood, when I started in the industry, flood zones was not really a factor in what insurance rates were, or if it was a very small amount. It didn't, quote, move the needle. But now we are seeing places where FEMA is lacking, and that's the map on the top here. All the white areas, this is about 40% of the country that lacks FEMA data. And this is not that there is no risk, it's just that there's no data, right? And so because of this change in the market, insurers are starting to view these areas as completely in the highest risk. So they price it as if it's in the full 100-year floodplain, and this is resulting in extra layers of insurance requirement, and this does have impacts on project economics. I mentioned financing parties in regards to brownfield, but this also comes into play for natural hazards, that some financing parties are requiring additional insurance for projects that are in higher Nat Cat areas. And then finally, last year we saw some legislation come out of California that allows insurance providers to consider climate change in issuing coverage. However, there's no guidance or direction for developers in how do we consider climate change in designs. And of the 20 different regions that my company works in, there's only one country that provides authoritative data and direction on how to incorporate climate change scenarios in site-specific hydrology and hydraulics models, because that's really where we integrate our design approaches. All right, just to expand on this a little bit further, the IPCC has found that climate change has detectably influenced several of the variables that contribute to floods, such as rainfall and snowmelt. Now, in addition to the challenge of gaps of data, we also have some challenges with the FEMA data around how recent they are. So even though there's a requirement that FEMA reassess its maps every 5 years, nearly 60% of those are out of date. And so the more red it is, the more out of date it is on the map. We saw this play out in Hurricane Sandy in 2012, when the flooding covered an area that was 65% larger than the flood vulnerable area, according to FEMA. And according to NOAA analysis, greater rainfall has made what used to be a 100-year event in Houston, by FEMA standard, more like a 25-year event. So we really are in a time, and we are seeing impacts on the landscape, but yet we also have data that we rely on that is perhaps out of date or doesn't cover certain areas. Okay, now I'm going to switch to the industry's response to these challenges. So I kind of walked through each of the challenges. Now I'm going to come and talk about, how we are committed to proactively and collaboratively addressing these so we really can deploy solar at scale. One of these efforts is the Uncommon Dialogue, and this is an effort that has been spearheaded out of Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. They did a previous one on river conservation and hydroelectric dams. They are just getting one kicked off for transmission. This one is specific to solar energy. So we came together, and you can see the partners here. It was several renewable energy developers, as well as environmental NGOs and working land groups. We came together, wrote this agreement to advance climate, conservation, and community goals. Since signing the agreement, we've gotten to work, rolled up our sleeves, and we are formed working groups on siting, information tools, policy, tribal, community engagement, and agricultural technologies working groups. I sit on the siting working group, and I co-chair the information tools working group myself. And some of these challenges that I shared with you around brownfield and are things that we've talked about in our siting working group. And we've made policy recommendations that we then push onto the policy team working group to work on trying to bring those to light. Information tools, we're really looking at cataloging all of the existing information tools that relate to climate conservation and community to do a gaps analysis and to instruct any future tool development to really be focused on those areas and those questions that information tools, new information tools can be developed to help us progress on. All right, our solar sites are also opportunities for living laboratory. We participate in research as a private company to help move the science forward as well. So this is our project in Penn State, and I want to call out my colleague Lexi Hain, who leads our entire agrivoltaics program and much of our research. So we're looking at this site, and we just got the study completed. So we're looking at how the effects of solar grazing on carbon, vegetation quality for livestock, and overall site conditions. And we're working with Cornell Labs, Soil Health, to do all of our testing. So we have found that soil matter at graze sites was significantly greater than non-graze sites. And so these full results will be presented at the Global Agrivoltaics Conference this July. And then another research site that we have is in Indiana. And you can see the long list of partners here that we have on this project. And we're really looking at supporting research where we are looking at pollinator habitat while we are also sheep grazing and doing beekeeping. If we have time, or maybe I'll share this afterwards, we do have a fun informational tool for this site where you can take a virtual tour of the project and see the research activities, see the pollinator habitats, for instance. All right, now this isn't research, but it's another way that we are trying to make considerable action through our projects. And this project in Arkansas is in a location that's very important for the monarch butterfly. And so in addition to the pollinator habitat under the panels, we have created a 5-acre area of native diverse plants providing habitat and critical nectar for monarch butterflies and pollinators. And my colleagues Blaine Gunderman and Peter Lawn were also incredibly instrumental in making this happen. And I just got this photo from Blaine this morning to show you what this pollinator habitat is looking like now, and it's looking gorgeous. Okay, now I'm going to circle back and talk about natural hazards again. So we have seen some changes in the industry. We've seen changes in technology. So and Lightsource BP was one of the first organizations to start this active weather monitoring. All of our projects are single axis tracking versus fixed tilt. And that's what this graphic represents, is that we generate more electricity by following the sun throughout the day. But this also means that we have the ability to stow the panels when severe weather is coming. So we watch all of our projects 24 hours a day to see if hail is potentially coming, and we stow the project so that instead of a direct hit where the most damage could occur, it's tilted, and so if it does hit, it's more of a glancing blow. But because we've seen more and more losses, the panel and tracker manufacturers have also reacted, and they are coming out with panels that have thicker glass, so they'd be more resilient, and trackers that stow at even a steeper angle. Some are actually stowing completely vertically. So this is a pretty big game changer for the industry, just in terms of what is available for us to choose in terms of more resilient technology. Another thing that's on the forefront, it's not here yet, but there is a startup that's looking at steel frames. We use aluminum on the frames for our panels now, but there's an argument that particularly in areas that are exposed to higher wind loadings, steel frames would be more resilient. And then we've also seen some changes in design standards over the last couple years. So we design everything according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, whatever the current design standard is. But historically, we developed to risk category 1. That changed a couple years ago to risk category 2. And where that has the biggest difference within the geography of the US is really the Southeast, right? And really creating more resilient structures and design standards for areas exposed to increasing severity of hurricanes. And I think it's also kind of interesting because we've seen some differences in terms of the feedback from off-takers, particularly if utility is looking to buy the entire project and operating it as part of their portfolio. In some instances, they may ask for designing to risk category 3, or they may ask more pointed questions about how you anticipate to use operational and siting and design considerations for resiliency measures within your project. And then I wanted to talk about Lightsource BP, because this has been a labor of love for me since I started, almost day one. And with my background in data and science, I have really worked with the organization to create a process where we do robust, data-driven risk assessments that, yes, we leverage public data, but we supplement that with purchased data sets to make up for those holes and also to consider climate change impacts. And we do this to inform avoidance, mitigation, and operational strategies. The graphic on the bottom is really to illustrate how resiliency starts from site identification, of understanding risks, doing a deeper dive in terms of site exposure, and using that information to incorporate into our site design, whether that's through avoidance, technology selection, or increased design features. Operational mitigation is incredibly important. I talked to you about the hail mitigation program, but we also have a program to stow for wind speeds to minimize any damage to our sites. As well as vegetation management is crucial, one, to creating a healthy ecosystem that when it rains, there's high amounts of soil infiltration. But it's also a mitigation strategy for fire risk. And then as we operate these projects, they will operate for 30 plus years, right? This is decades. Things could absolutely change in that time. So as we go through operationally, if we see damage on a site, for instance, with floods, when we go in and we repair those trackers, we could put flood sensors in so that in future floods, the trackers stop before they get to the water point. Always keeping up on your emergency action plan and keeping that up to date with your current risks is also an incredibly important part of adaptive management. And all of this is done with really a lot of collaboration with internal partners, but also our external insurance providers and brokers, as well as local emergency response. Additionally, I have started a global climate and disaster technical cohort to bring people across the globe together to learn, share, and build capacity around climate and disaster resiliency. And just on the research side of things, from the hazards perspective, we partnered with a startup, 60 Hertz, got a DOE grant to look at the impacts of wildfire smoke on solar production. And they have a forthcoming article that's coming out in KWH Analytics, 2025 Solar Risk Assessment Report. And it's not even that these the fires and the smoke need to be close to the site, but we are seeing that even hundreds of miles away, these very large fires are having impacts on production. So helping them to advance their research by partnering with them to provide actual real site data. We were one of several developers to partner with them, and they would not have been able to really do this research without this type of partnership. And then broader industry engagement is also really important. That we need to talk, yes, about this within our own organization, but we need to talk about it broadly within the industry. So last year I was on a panel for mitigating risk for extreme weather. Next month I'll be on a panel for resilient and bankable project development in a changing climate. And then one of my I like to call them resilient champions, who is part of the cohort, is going to be presenting on building assets for future resilience in Portugal this summer as well. So I just want to kind of conclude now with some thoughts. We absolutely need solar deployment to both address our climate crisis and our biodiversity crisis. We can do this in parallel. Solar is the lowest energy cost solution. Okay, a recent study found that it's about 56% lower than the lowest cost fossil fuel. So it's pretty hard to stop progress just from an economic perspective, right? And the graph on the top here, this shows the solar deployment history. Now, when I started was 2008, so I'm kind of off the chart. It was hardly a blip, right? And you can see how that has exponentially grown. And the policy of our last administration really did help that come to fruition. 2024 is an outstanding year. It was absolutely the peak year. Now, clearly we can see that there's some tapering off, But I want to highlight that even in all of these years where it tapers off, it is still more than what was installed in 2022 or 2023. So the future is still really bright. Now, we have had some shifts in the policy at the federal level. Our prior administration did a lot with the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, really pushed a lot of development of clean, renewable energy sources. And now things have shifted. We are no longer in the Paris Climate Accord. There's more of a focus on all of the above and fossil fuels. But there's also a lot at the state level that's being done. But it is a bit of a patchwork, right? So the bottom map is our renewable energy standards. We can see some states have none at all, and some states are very aggressive, like Hawaii. Hawaii has a 100% by 2045 goal. Now that makes a lot of sense because they have to ship in all of the fossil fuels that are brought to the island, right? We've also seen some legislative efforts at the state level, largely around siting. Some of these legislative efforts have been to encourage siting and create processes to create more formalization on how we work with state agencies to review our projects, like in Colorado. And in other places, we see legislative efforts that's really in place to try to stop deployment of renewable energies. Sometimes these things look like you can't put a solar panel or a wind turbine within so many thousand feet of a property boundary. But in actuality, what that does is it limits really being able to deploy that energy at all, or if it is deployable, it's only on the absolute largest parcels, and so it's really limited in where it could go. So it's important to be continually monitoring these, and we have a really great government affairs team that does do this for us. And then I mentioned climate-specific legislation. I think it's really interesting that we saw that come out of California. So I think it's also something to monitor and see what else comes out if other states follow suit, because many times states will see what their neighbors do and want to do something similar. All right, so last, I will leave you with get involved. There's lots of opportunities. A colleague of mine in Philly shared with me that there is this networking group, and they are looking for more engagement and more educational opportunities. It's a great way to meet people too. Internships. It's a really great way to get experience. Lightsource BP is actually hiring interns right now, so you can go on our website and see what internships might be available. But there are lots of other industry companies that also offer internships. Trade associations offer internships. Legislative internships, particularly if you're interested in policy, is a great way to understand how things work at the legislative effort and can absolutely help position you, perhaps if you wanted to go into lobbying, for instance, or other types of career paths within that. And then finally, research partnerships. I am really impressed with Princeton's kind of net zero approach, and I am going to hopefully be meeting with a solar grazer who's doing sheep grazing at one of your own solar sites here at Princeton. And so, I encourage you to use this as a living landscape, a living laboratory, right? Like, we have lots of opportunities, continue to do the great work, and I think, you are all in a position to carry that work forward. So with that, I will stop, because I really want to take your questions. Let's go back there first. I saw your hand first.
Say there's a problem with the transmission of the energy. Is it more of an infrastructure problem where all the towns are in remote areas, so then you don't have cables or whatever, or is it more of a technology problem of efficiency?
It's really an infrastructure issue. We have an aging infrastructure, aging transmission grid, and there has been regional transmission plans that have been put in place to strategically update lines to put more renewables online. Texas is actually a great example of that. The CREZ lines, they built out transmission lines to connect the areas of wind resources and sun resource to the load centers. So they opened up and we came and we filled those lines. So it's almost a never-ending type of scenario, right? That yes, we need to continue to do these transmission planning scenarios, and we need to continue to find funding and resources to make these upgrades. Many times the upgrades, if the utility is just doing it, it comes to the, back down to the ratepayer. But if a new facility is going online, that cost gets entirely put on that generator. And so sometimes that can make or break a project. So I think that it's infrastructure, but it's also process. We spend a lot of money just to understand what capacity is there. And then to find out, we have to pay X more millions of dollars to upgrade the line. So I think it's both infrastructure and also process and policy that could be improved upon. Storage, yes. Storage is, so we've started integrating storage into our portfolio more recently. And there are a lot of benefits that storage brings, right? It helps to put more renewable energy online because when the sun shines, the solar energy makes energy. When the wind blows, that's when the wind turbines make energy. And by being able to store that energy and then put it back onto the grid at a time when the energy is actually needed more, it allows for higher levels of renewable energy, as well as more grid reliability. Yeah, right ahead.
I have a question that covers non-US.
Okay, I will do my best.
So there's an A and a B. You did mention that one country provides you direction on hydrology and the model, so that was, I wanted to know what country that was. And given the tide against you in the US, who are you getting more response from from another country?
Yeah.
Where you see a lot more things going on that will also help your direction and development of the company.
Yeah, so it's important, I think we are well positioned as a global company that we can continue to operate in the United States and take advantage of those state level policies where there's still need. There's also a growing amount of energy need from AI and data centers, right? So demand for energy in the US is actually increasing. Yes, we may see some policy headwinds that were a little bit different than what we saw in the previous administration, but being the lowest cost of energy, solar is going to continue. Now, to your point about other countries, there is absolutely focus in other countries as well, and I would imagine that many global companies might double down on some of these other countries while we look at and evaluate what the possibilities are in the US. To your question about the hydrology data, is New Zealand. New Zealand's the only country, from my experience, where they really provide enough guidance and data to be able to implement it. We purchase flood models that are a coarser resolution than you would do at a site specific, and that's our first view. So this allows us to understand what potential flood depths could we see at a site where there's not FEMA data, or even if there is FEMA data there, right? Gives us more visibility on the potential, and some of these models do include climate change. So we can start to see what are the areas of the site that might see more flood potential. But those are done at a coarser resolution, so 10 meters in the US. In some of the other countries, it's more coarse at 30 to 90 meters. Whereas when we really do our design for the site, we fly the site and get high-resolution LiDAR data, and that is the basis for the hydrology assessments. And New Zealand has provided this data set of how do you not just model for current conditions, but you model for the different RCP scenarios. So you can look at RCP 8.5, which is unmitigated climate change, at a time in which the project is still operating, to try to get a view of what could the conditions be under climate change, and then design the site to try to accommodate conditions now as well as potential conditions in the future.
So brownfields are new to me, and I'm curious because you mentioned that the current policy puts the liability on the developer. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about what that liability looks like. Does it require remediation prior to development? Is it only in the event that there's some sort of contamination that's disturbed and then would require additional remediation? And then how does the financing around that work? Because the government often will use external contractors. Would your company have access to those same contractors, or would you have to do and put together essentially an external remediation team?
Yeah, those are really, really great questions, and I will do my best to answer them. So I will say I personally don't have experience building on brownfield sites because of all of these challenges. But it is absolutely a barrier, right? And you don't necessarily know the full extent of contamination. And we do a lot of studies like phase 1 ESAs to look for potential contamination already on the site. Many times that is around farmyards, so maybe there's some staining on the ground. So what our current practice is that we just exclude those areas from the lease. We're not going to build on them, we're not going to touch them, and they're not even part of our lease extent. So we are only developing on land where their liability potential does not exist. I should also say in Texas, I worked on some wind sites where the oil and gas development was done many, many, many years ago. And at that point, rather than having above ground storage tanks, they did mud pits where they would pump the material up until they got to the oil and just kind of put it in a pit next to the well. And many of those wells have been abandoned, okay? And so there is data on this, but the data is not precise. And when you know that you have potentially an area of contamination next to it, that was a situation where we couldn't necessarily go in and clearly define all of these and exclude them from the lease boundaries. But within wind, we were able to really consciously avoid putting anything close to those areas. Whereas solar is a much more land intensive in terms of the footprint. And so it would be much more challenging to be able to really just avoid those areas. And so you could potentially come into these materials unknowingly during construction. And that is when it becomes a problem and could be considered exacerbating the existing pollution. I saw, there was a gentleman who had his hand, you had your hand up really early. I'm sorry, why don't you ask your question?
Thanks, and it was an excellent talk. I was curious about if Lightsource BP is registering its solar projects in any existing registries.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of pursue the insurance of carbon credits or renewable energy credits and selling of those carbon credits in the market.
So the market is still very, very young in that regard. So there's not really a market to sell carbon credits on. There's some speculation. So at our Colorado site, we did a shortgrass prairie ecosystem restoration. And shortgrass prairie ecosystems are known to sequester carbon. Okay, this could potentially come into play further down the road, but right now there's not really a market for these types of things. But in terms of your question around like registering our sites, we very much do. For instance, NREL has an Inspire group, which is all about agrivoltaics, and they have a nationwide map of all of the different agrivoltaics and research initiatives that are going on across the United States in solar. And that's one that we've absolutely registered our projects into because we want to make sure that people, out there know the good that we're doing. There's another database by the USGS of operating photovoltaic sites, and that was based more on satellite imagery in order to capture those, but they also reference the Inspire database to, again, highlight those projects that bring that multi-use to front. Okay.
So I'm really happy to see that BP is getting into the renewable sphere. And I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on how large the commitment is, how that's affected the organizational structure of the company, what future plans might be for that type of renewable expansion.
So that's a great question. And so I should clarify that when I started with Lightsource BP, we were a 50-50 joint venture with BP. And just this last year, we finished the deal that we are 100% owned by BP. And so we are their sole onshore renewable developer, but we are still operating separately as Lightsource BP. So BP kind of has their own goals and we have our goals. I think a lot of companies are adjusting to changes in policy in terms of where they put their focus, but the commitment to renewables is still absolutely here and strong. And we are continuing with a 3 to 5 year plan in terms of our immediate goals to continue to deploy energy. And BP is absolutely a partner with us in this space. Many of the oil majors, I would say most of the oil majors now have a renewable energy branch and are trying to kind of reinvent themselves, not necessarily as an oil and gas company, but as an energy company. And I think BP was actually one of the first firms to really embrace that change. Yeah.
Okay, I missed this, but where are the solar panels manufactured?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's solar panels are manufactured around the world. And under the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a big focus to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And we've seen a lot of more domestic panel manufacturers as well as battery manufacturers. But many of them are also responding to the current climate. And so they're trying to decide, do we continue to make all of these factory investments in the United States or not? Lightsource BP, when we saw a couple years ago, there were some tariffs put in place in panels coming from specific regions in Southeast Asia. And when we saw that, we really saw the writing on the wall, and we worked really proactively to sign the largest agreement with First Solar. And so we signed like really a historic agreement with First Solar, which was one of the major manufacturers who is doing domestic manufacturing. Now, I think that there is some other countries in the world that are looking at kind of trying to fill that gap that aren't necessarily in this part of Asia where there was concerns around forced labor. So, countries like Laos, for instance, I've heard is kind of increasing their manufacturing. So I think just like the industry, there is very much a responsiveness. And so people right now are trying to kind of leverage what incentives were put in place to bring manufacturing back still, while still testing the waters to see, how is the next 4 years going to go. So I think we made really good progress in bringing a lot more manufacturing to the United States. How that continues to unfold, we'll just kind of have to watch.
Kind of a follow-up
Sure.
question to that then. Is there any issues that you're aware of with procurement of some of the rare materials that are needed to build these solar panels in the US? And do you think that there's going to be any issues, or what do you foresee?
Great question. A little outside of my personal subject matter expertise, but I think it's whether it's the panels, whether it's the materials for the panels, these are questions that we have to find answers for. And there are rules in the Inflation Reduction Act about like how much of the components need to be from domestic to be considered domestic content. So there's a lot of nuance kind of within that, and it's something that the industry is definitely working towards. But I also want to highlight that most of the materials in the panel themselves are recyclable, right? So I think that there hasn't been a lot of decommissioned projects as of yet, but as we get more and more decommissioned projects, we can also look at how can we reuse some of these materials versus having to go out and do kind of new mining for the resources. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I was curious about some of the biodiversity side of things, and obviously you mentioned a couple of projects that have really different components of biodiversity, and obviously it's a very site-specific and context-specific thing. So I was wondering if you had any sort of plans for like an overarching biodiversity framework that you might use to share general learnings from one project to another, or is it something that you really do evaluate case by case?
That's a really good question. So what we have done, it kind of depends where you are in the world. So in Europe, they have some very defined biodiversity metrics that are largely around vegetation, kind of before and after. In the US, we have chosen to use the restoration wheel as our metric for biodiversity uplift because it looks at things more broadly. It also looks at soil health, for instance. And so we can kind of come in and we work with consultants to do on-the-ground surveys to understand what our baseline is. How does the site rank in soils, in vegetation, in all of these different variables. And then we look for ways that we can improve those variables through our seeding, through we also do some, like one of our Texas sites, we put in bird boxes, we put in reptile habitat. We've preserved areas as forests that will not be, brought down during the life of our project. So it is very site-specific, but we do try to use scientific and vetted methods for measuring those biodiversity enhancements. And our goal is to be able to demonstrate a biodiversity improvement or net gain within the first 5 years of our sites. Yeah, so I'm going to kind of go back a little bit to my previous role in wind, because there are factors that have more importance and can kill a project. Transmission. For wind resource is another really important one. And so being able to look spatially where these are, but also layer in other considerations, like environmental considerations. And that helps us narrow in on sites from a desktop perspective. But then it's absolutely about collaboration and getting boots on the ground to go out there, look at the land, talk to the community, understand what their sentiment is and how willing they would be to host a renewable energy site. Talking with the landowners themselves, you have to have willing landowners to lease their land. So a lot of things do need to come together, and I think it's really important to start with science, start with data, start with a holistic and comprehensive approach as we can. We're lucky, we have a lot of great data in the United States that we can leverage, but that is the beginning, right? There's so much work that goes into community engagement, and there's another opportunity to give a shout out to some of my team. Kara Titus, she leads our community relations team in the US, and they are very active in going into communities, learning who the community members are, what are the specific needs of that community, how can our project help the community in their goals as well. So it's absolutely a two-part one. Yeah, so a lot of farmers in our country are aging, right? And not all of their children want to continue the farming tradition. Many of them, want to go to universities and have a different life. And so many of these people are in places in their lives where they're looking for another generation revenue stream. Competition, there's of course competition between renewable energy companies. If there is a substation that has great capacity, it's got great flat land, there could be competition just over getting the land signed. So that's kind of one aspect of competition. And we also try to view ourselves not as in competition with conservation or agricultural activities, because we strive to integrate those into our projects. So you mentioned chickens. There are some projects in the UK where they have chickens that come around and help maintain their vegetation as well. So there are more animals other than sheep that we could leverage. Some of those might require more modification to the design. There's a DOE grant solicitation right now for a cattle voltaics. So being able to put cattle on our landscape. If you recall from the cartogram slide, how much land we use for grazing cattle is a really large part of our country. And even though I've grown to love lamb, a lot of Americans isn't part of their palate, right? So how can we design solar to be compatible with grazing of cattle? And really what this comes at is cattle are larger animals. They like to rub up against stuff. So you have to elevate everything and keep all the moving pieces out of the area that they are within in order to prevent that damage. So yeah, there's a lot of work being done to advance that.
Elevated panels provide shade though.
They do. It is. It's just that it costs more to elevate them, right? So that's why sheep are our best partners right now, is because they're small, they don't rub up against things, they don't jump on the panels. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't find other agricultural activities to integrate with our sites.
Wow, tons of questions. Are you available to just
Yeah.
if someone individual wants
Absolutely.
to come up? Yeah, so if you didn't get to your questions, Lindsey can take them up here individually. I'd like to just close by giving a round of applause to Lindsey. Thank you for coming.